Okay, hi everyone. So today we'll be having exhibition game number two, and today's opponent for me would be Mario. He's from Spain and he's a five-time Spanish champion. Welcome, Mario, to the exhibition game.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Yes, I will be making the commentaries in Spanish, so some other type of audience also can follow the game. Okay, so if you agree, I will make some introduction in Spanish, and then we can start the game.
And Mario will be playing black, and I'll be playing white.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, my opponent has played f5. My first move, I will follow with my usual perpendicular, so I'll play to d6.
En este caso, Alex es un jugador que juega muchas salidas y es un poco y se la sabe muy bien, así que voy a intentar entrar en algo que no conozca demasiado para tener un poco de oportunidad. Vamos a intentar seguir con Tiger, que es una bastante estándar, y buscaremos una variación un poco más adelante.
Okay, so over here my opponent has moved to c3, which is quite a usual variation for the standard opening towards either Tiger or Stephenson. So I'll just follow with d3 being part of the book opening and cross back into the center.
Seguimos con Tiger y vamos a ir avanzando a intentar ver si él va a jugar más hacia Compol o si va a ir más hacia Noku. Mi esperanza es que entre más hacia Compol.
Okay, so my opponent has just followed with the standard book variation to c4. So over here, I am looking to play the usual variation. The usual variation will be f4. So let's go with f4 to just cross back.
En este punto tenemos dos grandes variaciones. Si movemos a c5 nos vamos hacia la Tiger y la Roseville, o si movemos en f6 nos vamos hacia la Stephenson, que es la que vamos a jugar. En este punto, f3 se va hacia la Compose, g5 se va hacia la Noku. Una de las dos variaciones se supone que jugará.
My opponent has actually moved to f6, which is the Stephenson opening. So over here, if I were to play f3, that would be the Komov variation, which usually leads to high variance endgames. And if I were to play the g5, that would be a no Kong variation, which is usually less variance in the endgame. And then there's also the third option to b4, which is the Kong variation, which is also somewhat fairly popular among players. So today I'm just going to go with Komov. So just trying to group the discs that are dispersed together into the center by a diagonal cut.
Ahora ha jugado la Compose más o menos como esperábamos, así que vamos a seguir la línea Compose, que el movimiento es un empate teórico y el siguiente movimiento es E6. Hay otras variaciones como E3, que se va a la Lightning Bolt y ese tipo de cosas, pero vamos a intentar hacer el mínimo de variaciones posibles para va a ser una posición ventajosa.
Okay, so my opponent has played e7 and basically jumps right into the middle and regroups his disc. So similarly, I'm just going to cut down the middle to e7 and just continue to maintain that group center and inside shape.
Dentro de la Stephenson nos situamos en un momento donde hay tres grandes variaciones. Podemos ir al movimiento más estándar de empate, que es de 7, que sigue hacia la Compose. Hay el segundo movimiento más jugado, que sería F7, que se va hacia la cama plaza o escorpión. Y luego tenemos la versión un poco menos conocida, que es la C6, que es la Logistello, donde poca gente la juega. En este caso vamos a mover hacia C6, hacia la Logistello, con una intención de que Alex no sepa tanto el libro y buscar alguna pequeña variación rebuscada que no sepa.
Okay, so my opponent has played c6, which is the Logistello variation. So over here, there are usually the most common book variation would be to play g6, which is somewhat like a head and tail theory, because when opponent has played c6, being the head of the move, you'll look for a quiet move at the tail end, which is g6. Another option would be actually to chip off to g5, even though you flip two discs in two different directions, but you somewhat regroup your side by keeping to the right side. And then the third option, which is probably, I think there are quite a number of options here for a second choice variation. You can also choose to play c5, so you can create some access to jump to e3. So that's one way to regroup to the center. You can also choose to play maybe f7. So today I'll elect to actually play something slightly different over here. So I'll jump to actually f7 as a slight variation to the usual. Probably the top two will be g5 and g6.
En este caso, sus movimientos más probables eran G5 y G6, sin embargo ha decidido mover F7. Es poco conocido y complica un poco las cosas. Su intención más que nada es hacer dos columnas de frontera y será un juego más de separación que no de intersección. Aquí las posibilidades que tenemos empiezan a ser numerosas. Logistello tiene muchas opciones y muy buenas, pero es difícil continuarlas, entonces hemos de tener claro dónde vamos a mover. En este caso a mí me gustaría seguir las fronteras, separando los colores, así que jugaría en la fila 8, algo como E8 o F8. E8 no me acaba de convencer tanto porque su movería hacia C5 y me dejaría una posición complicada con él teniendo acceso a E3. Así que mi intención va a ser mover en F8 y probablemente su contesta será en D8 o C5. Intentar romper las fronteras. Ahora vemos dos fronteras bastante paralelas en diagonal y él las va a entrar. Depende cómo la rompa, nosotros contestaremos de una manera u otra.
Okay, so following my move to f7, my opponent has played a nice quiet f8 move to the edge. So over here, usually you could have an immediate response to either go to d8 to try to contest for the edge. Also, because if opponent plays f8, the follow-up potential good move for him to be playing towards the edge would be to play g6. G6 basically controls the f6 and e7 mini diagonal. So that would actually remove away some good moves for me. Another option would be to actually, so if I wanted to prevent that from happening, I would probably consider b6, but b6 flips too many discs that are exposed to too many squares. So that would be prevention. If I wanted to poison and make this move less attractive, there isn't any way that I can do it at the moment. Another option would be to take the move, but I also cannot capture g6. So one good way to actually counter that control of mini diagonal would be to establish d8. So even if black goes g6, I can still cut back to g5. So that's one way to think about it, which is slightly more passive in terms of your opponent's moves. Another way to think of the game is to adopt a more active approach and just ignore g6 approach and maybe just go for my c5 that creates access to e3. So it's sort of like a trade-off. If I were to play c5 and he goes g6, I can jump into e3. So yeah, usually when you have one or two options in the game, you would need to actually weigh them by actually just reading slightly deeper into the game, probably just a few moves ahead, and see whether that shape is in favor of your play. So right now, I think if I imagine a sequence of d8, g6, g5, followed by maybe h5 sequence, instead of letting the opponent control the e7 to f6 mini diagonal, he might end up controlling the e6 to f5 diagonal. So I don't think that is probably a shape that I would prefer. So I'll go probably a more active approach. Probably go with c5 to create that e3 access and see how that goes.
Ha decidido romper las fronteras por el medio de manera un poco más agresiva, por lo que va a ser una secuencia de controlar el centro. En este caso, lo que más nos preocupa ahora es el acceso a E3, que blancas pueda entrar. Entonces, básicamente hay dos maneras de evitarlo. O entramos primero en E3 para que no pueda entrar, o le quitamos el acceso de C5 moviendo en B4. En este caso no sé cuál es preferible. En este caso lo que vamos a hacer es desarrollar un poco la secuencia y ver hacia dónde determina una opción o la otra. Si movemos en D3, él moverá en D8. Nosotros podríamos mover en B4 y se nos queda una posición un poco con demasiados discos. Parece que me gusta más la opción de B4, solo damos la vuelta a un disco y luego él, donde quiera que mueva, siempre tendremos la opción de D2 o E3. Así que vamos a ir con un movimiento tranquilo.
Okay, so my opponent has played b4. Basically, b4 is the first approach for the mid-game principle is to actually remove or prevent my move that I wanted, that is jumping into e3. So he basically removed my c5 disc. I think another name for it is evaporation. So basically, it's just to remove that c5 disc that gives me access to e3. Again, the shape on the right hasn't really changed much, so the d8 option is still available for me. And of course, I can also create back that access by jumping into b5, which also creates back that c5 disc that gives me e3. So another option that I would think about would be probably e8, that is slightly more risky, and let him establish that safe edge. The sequence that is foreseeable would be e8, d8, and then maybe jump into d7, which he momentarily doesn't have access to actually get into c8. But usually giving up an edge that is balanceable may not be that advisable. So right now I'm just weighing two options between b5 and d8. If I were to play d8 sequence to play out, the shape would probably end up exchanging moves to the bottom left and the top right region. So if I play out this way, I can still retain probably some moves to the left as well if the exchange were to just rotate in a clockwise manner. However, if I were to play b5 and just create back that e3 move, maybe there is a chance that the opponent doesn't. The opponent realizes that he's not able to remove back c5. He might jump into e3 and take the move itself. So right now, I think I'll go with d8 over b5 for a simple, quiet cutback into the center and see how the game moves from here.
Jugando D5, hay D8, hace un movimiento bastante tranquilo y no entra del todo en mi región. Así que soy yo el que parece que tengo que llevar un poco la iniciativa y es, aunque puede ser positivo, también es peligroso. Aquí la opción más rápida y más clara que se ve es D2, pero tiene el peligro de que él contestará con D7, por lo que entonces yo no puedo entrar en E3. Lo podría coger acceso de E5 entrando en G5, pero parece que se me complica mucho. Si repasamos es D2, D7, G5, cojo acceso en E5, él movería algo como G5 y entro en C7. No me parece mal del todo esta secuencia, pero también tengo la opción de mover en E3, que es un movimiento que me agrupa al centro, es sencillo y no tengo tanta problemática de hacer un error. Entonces, D2 me gusta, pero la veo un poco arriesgada. Y E2 parece más sencilla. Voy a pensar un poco más, a ver cuál es más positiva. Me sigue gustando más D2. Voy a jugar en E3. Me da miedo D2 de que se me complique demasiado. De esta manera no arriesgo tanto y le dejo a él la opción de romper la frontera. Creo que es mejor darle el riesgo, sobre todo en la Logistello, que es una salida es muy fácil hacer un error por los pocos tempos que hay. Es muy justa en tempos. Prefiero un error de uno de los dos, puede variar la posición de exceso para recuperarla después. Así que no vamos a arriesgar, sobre todo con Alex, que es muy peligroso en situaciones complejas.
So my opponent has played a centralizing move to e3. So even though let's take a look at that move. Even though he has flipped 3 discs in 2 different directions, it's still a relatively strong move because the move that he's placed is in the center 16. Usually, yeah, Logistello exchanges, usually there is a lot of exchange in tempo and moves around as you rotate around the board and try to intersect each other. So this move basically forms up a center shape in the center 16 boxes. So it's more likely that the moves that I play on the outside will actually result in diagonal cuts, and it is more poison. So over here, an immediate option for me would be probably c7. If I were to play the c7, a possible exchange would go by c7, d7, c8, or potentially c7, he would just capture c8, and then I would jump into d7, and he would capture the edge to e8, potentially. So that option would form, that exchange would actually result in a 4 disc balance edge for him, which is also with an additional 1 tempo to g8. So that's probably what I don't want to do at this moment. Another option that I can explore is to actually play to e2, to basically just form the long group shape. Even though I flipped 4 discs in one move, these 4 discs are actually largely in the center of the existing disc, so I don't really create new moves for my opponent. So a potential weak point about playing e2 is that he could jump into maybe g5 as a follow-up to target both moves, either to d7 or d2. If he jumps into d7, I'm not too worried if I have a disc along on the back of the diagonal, and I can just jump back to c8. So the more worrying one would be probably e2, g5, and then if I were to play somewhere along maybe either g4 or g6, he would then jump into d2 and regroup there. So looking at the situation, I think weighing between the other moves on the left probably wouldn't really give me much benefit, because I would create more moves for him to the left, and at the same time, I wouldn't really be able to pull him over to the right side. So now it's a bit of a tug of war. He's pulling me to the left, and I'm trying to pull him to the right. So weighing between c7 and probably e2, I would probably have a slight preference for e2. So let's go with e2 now.
Jugando en E2, lo que hace es continuar esta guerra de las dos fronteras, de negra a la izquierda y blancas a la derecha, y me está obligando a romper su frontera y entrar hacia la derecha. Es una batalla de a ver quién estira más hacia cada lado. Ahora para nosotros hemos de decidir cómo entramos a la derecha. No tenemos ningún movimiento posible hacia el oeste, así que hay 2 o 3 opciones. Podemos considerar F1, que su contesta seguro será D1 y nos quedamos en una situación parecida. Y luego tenemos G4 y G5 para romper las fronteras. La idea de jugar en G4 es que luego podremos entrar en D7 automáticamente. La idea en G5 es que quitamos el acceso de D5, que nos puede ser beneficioso. Sin embargo, G5 también él consigue un movimiento fácil, G4, G6, y luego me quitará ese acceso para entrar en D7. Así que parece algo mejor mover en G4 para garantizar ese acceso a D7 que estábamos comentando. Sin embargo, F1 no me desagrada como movimiento de trámite. ¿Por qué? Porque él estará obligado a mover en D1 y creo que la posición de F1, D1, G4 es mucho mejor que no moviendo G4 directamente. Así que vamos a hacer ese movimiento de trámite de F1 para crear una situación peor para blanca.
Okay, so now my opponent has played to f1, which is somewhat unexpected because I was expecting either g4 or g5. So if I were to play a simple group move, would be something like d7. But d7 flips 1 disc in one direction, but it forms sort of like a block shape, which opens up a potential move to c7 for my opponent. And also it unlocks g3 potentially for my opponent. So some other options would be maybe b5, which is somewhat of a head and tail theory because my opponent has played f1 and flipped a disc in diagonal direction. This opens up a quiet move for me to b5. And then, of course, the third option would be probably either d2 or d1. If d2, he would just probably capture the edge and continue in that direction and just try to bring me up to the top. And if I were to play d1, it will be a cross-back exchange, and then the follow-up would be probably either g4 or g5 for him to actually create that move back. If I were to weigh between playing to the top and to the bottom, I would actually slightly prefer to actually stopping either the g4 or the g5 move or working around that way. So if I were to play d7, Black may play over to either g4 or g5 that actually cuts, probably g5 that cuts for the e5 disc to get access to c7. And then I will probably follow up with either blocking the move to b6. So the other option would be the b5, and my opponent will probably play something like a6 perhaps, or potentially do some move to the right. Right now I'm considering between b5 and d7. So usually when there are considerations for two moves that you feel that are within your short list, you'll probably consider the sequence and see whether they obstruct each other. So if I were to play b5, it potentially obstructs d7, and if I were to play d7, it potentially obstructs the future b5, unless I were to try to aim for b6 instead of b5 with that continuation in mind. So right now I would slightly prefer d7 actually, considering the future play out and sequence compared to maybe b5. If I were to play d7, I figured that maybe I could potentially capture a few tempos, d7 followed by maybe b6 and b5 in the future. And at the same time, just grouping my discs together. So let's go with d7.
En este caso no ha entrado en D1 como pensamos y por lo contrario ha jugado D7, que agrupa mucho su columna y sus grupos. Así que no sé si he hecho un error con F1 o es el que me está dando demasiados accesos, porque ahora, por ejemplo, te puedo mover con mucha facilidad en G4 y G5 para dar accesos a D2 y G7. G3 no me gusta, G4 no me gusta demasiado porque flipea F3. En cambio, sí me gusta G5 porque me da directo acceso a F7 y no lo puedo evitar. Sin embargo, rompo por el medio su frontera y puede ser peligroso y que tenga desventaja, pero actualmente no veo ninguna otra opción que no sea esta.
Okay, so my opponent has played g5. This is probably expected because after I formed that block shape to the bottom left, c7 is exceptionally vulnerable because if he manages to play this, this move to b6 is potentially poisoned. So right now, Black has established that access via capturing e5 disc. So over here, I have essentially probably four options. Usually a cut out like g5, probably you would consider immediately either g4 or g6. But because this shape also implicates c7, so the options that I'm also considering would be either b5, which is almost like a head and tail theory because it's a quiet move, or if b6 were a quiet move, I would also consider it, but right now I still have the e3 disc that somewhat obstructs myself. So the fourth option would be probably to look at d2 to cut into the center and ignore that. But right now I think the e5 disc is a bit too strong and there's no need for me to cut to the top or the left. I would actually consider between either g4 or g6, and also of course the b5 move. So I think b5 doesn't really prevent c7 from happening, so that would still remain poisoned. So I think I would slightly prefer to actually work my tempo between g4 or g6. So G4 being an inner B disk and G6 being an inner A disk, I would actually usually the advice here would be to actually just jump into the inner B disk, which would mean G4. So the sequence that I'm looking at is either G4 followed by a response by black to C7, which somewhat prepares his next move to potentially H4 to actually control this mini diagonal across, or G4 followed by his cross back into D2, but that would actually create a new move for me to G3. So unless there's a reason to actually play G6 over G4, usually G4 is the better move. So at this point in time, I can't really see any reason for G6 to weigh strongly for G4, because the playout would probably go now a bit more to the anti-clockwise and going towards the right-hand side. Yeah, let's go with G4.
C4 es un movimiento bastante estándar y de trámite, y esperábamos que moviera ahí. Y ahora nosotros tenemos varias opciones, aunque parece clara que la buena es C7. Podríamos pensar entre D2, podríamos pensar incluso C4, pero eso lo complica en exceso. En principio C7 parece lo normal y continuamos con la guerra de fronteras. Volver a entrar dos movimientos seguidos en la zona derecha, en el este de la partida, me parece excesivo. Y luego cuando jugamos C7, aunque él mueva en cualquier parte, podemos volver a entrar, por ejemplo, en G6 o incluso H5, dependiendo de dónde juegue.
So as expected, opponent has played an easy quiet move to C7, so that will probably surely be his best move. So right now the challenge here is to actually figure a way to respond for this G5 disk that he's created, because the next move that is probably good for black would be to play D2, which is a cut back into the center while maintaining the controls of the access to the diagonals. So if black were to play D2 right now, assuming now it's black's turn, I wouldn't really have access to F2 or G3. So I would probably have to remove the G5 disk at this point in time. However, usually when you approach an edge this way, you have basically four options to remove this disk, and it's typically quite hard to actually discern the differences or the minor differences of the playout unless you foresee the moves a few moves ahead, and still, you can still get that wrong. So G6 or H6, H5 or H4, four options for me to choose to actually remove this G5 disk. So if I were to, let's talk about maybe G6. G6 is usually the standout option that is probably not that advisable, because you don't really get a grip of the edge, and in fact you probably give or surrender control of the edge to your opponent. So some options that I would probably consider usually would be to consider either H6, which is the most popular option, being H6 grabbing the edge and taking control of it, and at the same time, if black were to jump into maybe G6 in response to find access to C8, I can actually play H5 to regroup to the right. Let's talk about H6 first, being probably the most popular option in such a shape. H6, G6, probably H5 and C8, and black would potentially have a free tempo to E8 if I don't respond to B8, and at the same time, after black captures E8, black can further take one more move to potentially G8. So that's probably something we want to avoid, being controlled of the center. But if that sequence were to follow potentially white, black, white, black, white, black, potentially I could cut back to B5 because this disk has been removed. So H4 and H5 is probably similar to H6 in a sense that it doesn't really, it's trying to control the edge, but it doesn't really address the bottom edge issue. So G6 is actually quite an attractive move for black to actually create E6 that goes into C8. So for this reason, I think that actually G6 would be quite a good move for me to just block right now, because black doesn't really give, it doesn't really give black a good option to actually respond. if he were to take any of the moves on the right side, it doesn't seem like a very good option for him. The possible sequences that I foresee is g6, h6 perhaps. So let's go with g6 to just regroup to the right.
Aquí blancas tenía muchas opciones de jugar y ha jugado G6, haciéndolo, sobre todo complicándolo. A lo mejor no es el mejor, pero sí dificulta más mis opciones. Aquí el secreto parece tener acceso a cortar E7 de alguna manera, E7 o F5 para coger acceso a C8. La manera que entremos cambiará mucho las cosas porque podemos poner H4, H5, no, H5 no, H4, H6 me gusta, pero sin duda nos lo va a dar H5, H4 y luego puede ser que nos mueva en E1 para forzar que la coger de 1 y darla y voltear toda esa mini diagonal. Entre H6 y H4, así que vamos a ir a H6, parece lo más lógico con la intención de atacar a C6 en cuanto podamos, en C8 en cuanto podamos. Y si nos lo da, lo vamos a coger.
Yeah, so the opponent has played h6, creating that e6 disc, which will give him future access to c8. So c8 is quite an important square right now and is definitely being contested quite strongly. So the immediate response in consideration would be to actually play h5 and probably try to capture the right edge. However, if I play h5, it removes the g6 disc, which would then actually enhance the value of blacks playing c8 and threaten a potential tempo capture, and then I would then be forced to somewhat capture b8 in response to form an unbalanced edge that is probably potentially attackable. So I'd like to see whether that would be in favor of myself. So yeah, for now I don't really see any moves to the left that actually create that actually poses as a quiet move for me at the moment. H5 is actually pretty poison for black itself. So potentially I will want him to play it, but if I don't respond to H5 right now, I lose control to this mini diagonal between G6 and F7. So I think I will just go with H5 at this point in time.
H5 era previsible y me estoy quedando sin movimientos y sin tempos. ¿Por qué? Porque solo puedo jugar H4, puedo jugar C8, pero perdería un tempo lo más seguro. No estoy seguro porque también tengo en el sur un par más de movimientos. Lo que sí que veo que F1 solo me está dando problemas ahora. Y eso quiere decir que a lo mejor en su momento cuando lo jugué no era lo ideal. Porque me envenena todas estas posiciones en el norte cuando él juegue uno. Así que probablemente no fue una buena decisión jugar ahí. Pero bueno, ahora ya está ahí. Ahora hemos decidido H4, que parece lo más obvio, porque dejamos C8 para luego y cortamos F4, que es realmente importante. ¿Qué pasa si jugamos H4 y nos mueven E1? Lo tendremos que ignorar jugando D2, incluso jugando H7 no veo más opciones.
Okay, so my opponent has decided to play H4, which is just controlling the edge. This move I would see it as something slightly more aggressive because he's trying to obtain tempo to H7 and potentially G8 in the future, which can actually present itself to be quite a huge threat in terms of controlling the edge. Also, if he plays H7, it removes my G6 disc, which is access to G3 move. So if I wanted to retain those moves, I would almost have to immediately jump into G3 to actually try to keep that move. Another option here would be to actually play maybe H3 with him jumping into H2, which form that unbalanced edge. But that is only possible if I have access right now to G7 to actually attack that unbalanced edge. So if just looking to try to create that access, maybe I could probably play D2. And of course, if I play D2, I create the D6 disc that probably gives me access to g3, assuming he responds to h7. And d2 also creates a move at d4, which potentially allows me to attack the unbalanced h if he were to play elsewhere. I could then go with that sequence. Yep. So I think just weighing between d2 and g3 right now. I'll probably slightly prefer d2 at this point in time to just cut into the center and try to gain access to key positions in anticipation of his moves to either h7 or c8.
La verdad es que 2 dedos complica las cosas bastante porque había creado una frontera en medio, las piezas centralizadas, y ahora crea muchas opciones con muchas de riesgo. Sobre todo también coge acceso a G7, por si yo empiezo a coger las paredes de la derecha. Y sigo con F1, que me crea problemas si él juega en E1, así que esa columna D debería estar blanca. En el momento que la corte me va a mover en E1, así que tengo que cuidar. Movimientos como F2 no los puedo jugar porque contestarán con E1. Y si juego cosas como C1 para hacer un pequeño puente, tendrá su contesta rápida. El movimiento es crítico, es de esos movimientos en la partida donde un fallo te puede costar ya la preparación del final, o acertarlo puede hacer que el oponente cree errores fácilmente. Básicamente estoy considerando E1, me parece una opción de trámite, pero que me ayuda a fortalecer la posición. C1 para parar su ataque, pero su contesta es fácil en F2 si me complica la posición, tendría que moverlo en C2. C8 me gusta, pero tampoco no crea nada, prefiero guardarlo para luego. H6 no me acaba de convencer porque estoy creando posiciones muy arriesgadas que en el juego final me van a pasar factura. Así que tengo que ir a jugar movimientos tranquilos. F2 hemos dicho que nos crea problemas porque juega E1, así que casi que estoy dudando entre 1 y C1. E1 contestará C1 y C1 contestará F2. C1, F2. ¿C2 funciona? No, porque luego me da E1, cojo D1 y volteo F3. Voy a jugar movimiento tranquilo de trámite E1 y dejarle a él que tome la iniciativa. Probablemente jugarán C1, pero luego puedo cortar el acceso para que no entre A1 cuando F2. Pero me da pánico que me dé la parte derecha y vaya a G7, creando aquí una pared embalanceada.
So the opponent has played E1, which is a diagonal cut towards the top and trying to retain the edge. Almost an immediate response over here for such a cut would be a diagonal cut across to actually C1 to contest the edge, and at the same time to poison the move to C2, which is a potential good follow-up for black. So usually that is probably the first the first instinct that you should the first move that you should look at. If there are no white discs on this C column, probably the urgency is not that high because it wouldn't be this C1 move wouldn't be poisoned with a C2 move by black. So of course the second option would be the line that we already considered and prepared for earlier at H3. H3 maybe potentially a H2 follow up, and I would then jump into G7, which is poisoning that unbalanced edge. And he probably wouldn't take away G6 because that would be too poisoning for his move. But any moves along maybe F2 would also remove the E3 disc that actually creates that access for my C1 move. So at the same time, we can still do that sequence to H3 and H2, even if he were to play C8 in response after C1. If he plays H7, I could still jump into G3. So probably one sequence that I'm slightly more concerned about if I were to play c1 would be c1, h7, g3, and then he has a move to g8, which controls this mini diagonal, which I have no access to. So that would be quite a high risk game following up. So right now I prefer to play c1 and just probably take a higher risk here and see how the follow up goes.
Básicamente está haciendo lo mismo que yo, intentar no arriesgar y dejar el riesgo al oponente para solucionar esta opción que es compleja. Hay muchas opciones. Yo estoy rodeando blancas están más centradas, yo tengo más accesos y opciones. Es complicado, así que no se arriesga. Me parece lo normal. A veces arriesgarse demasiado en partidas tan complejas y salidas como la Logistello traen problemas luego. Aquí mi opción me parece que solo tengo F2, parece una opción clara, pero claro, me da miedo que él vaya H3, H2, jugaría, luego me queda acceso a G3 y el símbolo G7, o podría mover en C8, pero como C8, esta parte de abajo es donde tengo más tiempo, junto con H7, perdón. Así que quiero mantenerlo. Voy a jugar sencillo también. Le paso la pelota jugando a F2.
So right now, opponent has played F2, which is somewhat unexpected, but now seeing that how the shape has developed, it's actually advantageous for him to capture the d4 disc, which removes my access to g7. So the sequence that we talked about earlier was removed. And at the same time, I don't have immediate access to d1, so I would say that f2 move is very effective in terms of trying to remove access. So right now, I believe I don't really have much of a choice. I would probably have to still try to chase up. I would either have two options, would be to either chase d1 access by playing it to the right, top right, or just simply ignoring it and playing maybe to the left, utilizing my moves there. So the potential way of him capturing tempo to the bottom right would be probably starting with h7 first, because if he plays g8, I actually have a move to e8, and if he responds to c8, then it wouldn't make sense for him to lose that additional tempo that he can win. So probably you would go h7 and then followed by g8. Waiting for h7 would probably mean that I have a potential maybe quiet move to g3 in the future, but g3 capturing f3 to gain access to d1 is easily removable by him responding to h3. From a head and tail theory perspective, he's played f2. I can also consider b6 right now. So right now, I think I would actually, in fact, consider b6 as a move, because b3 is probably not too great. B3, b5. Okay, yeah, I'll go with b6 move.
Ha movido en B6, no esperaba que abriera. Es verdad que jugando B6 me quitaba el movimiento bueno que tenía en C8 guardado, pero creo que le puede traer problemas, porque ahora mi idea es jugar D1, no tengo muchas otras opciones, y se le va a envenenar si juegan G6 abriendo, así que no puede jugar. Así que mi D1 irá seguido probablemente por B5, ya que D3 es negro, yo tendré que mover en A3 y seguirá la batalla por el noroeste. Actualmente no tengo otra opción, podría jugar en H7, pero lo de siempre es complicar las cosas. Tengo H7 y tengo ejes 8, dos tempos aquí buenos, pero prefiero guardarlos, prefiero jugar simple a D1.
Okay, so my opponent has played d1, which is quite an obvious touch to the edge to attempt to take control of the edge, or either feed the edge to me by playing g1, which is unlikely for me to play. So almost immediately I would consider b5, because it's a quiet move in continuation of my b6 move to gain tempo and just remain to the bottom left. Yep, so probably the only move that I'm concerned about playing b5 is him responding to a5 perhaps. And the usual sequence of capturing the h would be either a3 followed by a4 or either b4 or b5 a5 and then I can try to create access to a6 by playing maybe c2, but I would actually be slow to the move because he already has that access to a6. So let's go along with b5 first and see how that plays out.
B5 es el movimiento claro, no podía jugar para nada en G1. Yo ahora tampoco tengo demasiadas opciones. O me meto en B1 o A5, que parece lo lógico. ¿Qué pasa? Que A5, G1 y se me complica un poco. A lo mejor tendría que mover en A6, pero claro, empieza a cerrar. Bueno, sería cerrar, hacer una fila central de negras y dejar blancas a los laterales. Un poco de efecto de hot dog que le llamamos. Siempre es bueno estar en medio, ser el Frankfurt y no el pan que decimos. Así que vamos a seguir esta estrategia a ver qué tal.
Okay, so he's played a5. So the usual H play follow-up for a move like a5 would be to either feed the unbalanced H to a6, which I don't have access to, or to form a balanced H for myself to play a3 and hope he plays a4. Usually a4 is probably played only when I have some white disc along the f1 to b5 diagonal. So that would be more like a poison move for me. So if I were to play a3, there's probably a high chance that there's a follow-up to b3 move. So let's just go with a3. So earlier on, I didn't want to play g1 also because if I capture the h and this diagonal, I basically poison all my moves to the left and also to the right by establishing too many discs. So let's play a3 now.
Está claro que A3 era mejor que G1. G1 envenenaba demasiado, así que él se resiste a seguir con esta posición. Y nosotros también estamos un poco limitados de movimientos. B1 no me gusta cogerlo porque creamos estructuras potencialmente arriesgadas para el final. Si jugamos cosas como A4, que es un incentivo, no nos soluciona nada. A4, A6, B1 y aún le queda B3 libre para jugar sin voltear nada, así que A4 no funciona, hemos de buscar algo mejor. H7 no es opción porque tenemos ahí un stoner muy arriesgado, así que si jugamos H7, G2 no es solucionable. B1 no me desagrada, pero él movería G7, hay G2, G3, H2 y esto es demasiado complicado solucionarlo. Prefiero seguir con la estrategia central. Vamos a pensar en mover en A6 y dejarle que él arriesgue. Lo más seguro es que mueva en B3, pero luego se lo damos y vamos a B1. Quedaría algo así como A6, B3, H4, A4, A7, entonces pues, entraremos en B1 con el riesgo de que él entre en G2, pero bueno, ya tiene la tarea balanceada y podemos arriesgar un poco más.
So the opponent has played a6, which is somewhat out of my expectations. So an immediate response would probably be to a4 to try to feed that unbalanced H. Currently it's not attackable because I have control of the entire 7th row over here. So I wouldn't be able to jump into b7 and try to attack that unbalanced H. So along this diagonal there are still empty squares to be played, so it's probably important for me to try to still retain access to this diagonal. So yeah, a4 is probably almost an immediate response that is required here. So just go ahead with a4, because if I play b3, it just allows black to feed that unbalanced H back. So let's go a4.
En este caso pensaba que jugaría B3 en lugar de A4. No quiere coger el muro balanceado y quiere que lo coge yo a consta de tempos para él. Aquí estoy forzado 100%, porque lo tengo que coger. La opciones. ¿Qué va a jugar luego? Cogemos A2. Va a mover sin duda B3. Vamos a 2. Juega B3. Y ahí la cuestión es qué hacemos nosotros. Entrar en B1, él entrará, vamos a 2, B3, y entramos en B1, jugará C2 y nos queda una posición bastante fea, pero tampoco tenemos otra opción que continuar por ese camino. No me gusta para nada seguir por A2, pero tampoco veo otra opción. B1 no. Vamos a seguir por A2, parece que es lo más instintivo y a ver qué pasa. Sin embargo, empieza a crear muchas paredes imbalanceadas. Sorry. No.
So the opponent has taken A1, which is taking the balance edge. He has to take it because if not, he might lose tempo. So right now, I would actually consider almost immediately B3 because the 3 discs that I flipped with B3 basically nestles between all the existing discs. So let's go with B3 almost as an immediate response to that move.
Como decíamos, la posición se nos está complicando demasiado. ¿Por qué? Porque ahora hemos de jugar en C2 o D1. C2 no parece correcto porque él moverá en G1, hemos de abrir y sin duda él puede coger acceso de vuelta para jugar en B1 sin problema. Así que no nos parece acertado. B1 parece lo más lógico, pero él entra en C2 y se nos queda posición compleja también. Especialmente porque luego que vamos a jugar, si jugamos B1, C2, no podemos jugar nada como H7 porque tenemos el stoner ahí. Lo único que se me ocurre es jugar B1, C2 y tirar la diagonal hacia B7. Eso podría funcionar. Porque él ha de entrar en la zona noreste de la esquina de H1 sin paridad para coger la esquina. Puede ser que funcione. Es que no veo otra cosa. Estoy súper limitado. C2 no funciona para nada. Así que vamos a probar esto. Es muy arriesgado y no sé si va a funcionar. No tiene mucha pinta, pero vamos a probar a ver.
So my opponent has played B1 to go for like a double unbalanced edge that is facing towards the A1 corner. So if he plays such a move, it's probably obvious that he expects me to play C2. If I were to play C2, potentially it's getting harder and harder for me to actually control the diagonal. And as we move and progress towards the end game, the diagonals become very important. Also because the squares that are remaining to be played with is actually narrowing down as both players, occupy more and more squares on the board. If I don't take C2, he would probably take C2, which would transform the game into something that is very high risk. I'm thinking so this is almost like a semi-wall. Usually a wall is defined by a 4x2 disc block that is attackable, but right now it's almost like an incomplete 4x4. If I were to jump into C2 and he doesn't remove the C2 disc, I wouldn't be able to play a potential floating x squared to G2, which would create more moves. And at the same time, C2, maybe he can control the diagonal by playing into something like B7, which is hard for me because the only way that I'm actually intersecting this main diagonal between F3 and B7 is actually the tail end of it, which is easily removable. If I were to play G3, he can just respond with H3. So it's almost becoming more and more difficult for me to find moves there. So I sometimes also like to think of the lead diagonals, the two lead diagonals as being the 5th and 6th edges to the game. In a sense that if you don't control the diagonals, you actually lose tempo there. So for now, I'm actually considering between G2 and C2. So right now, I think I actually slightly prefer G2 if I look slightly further ahead because I have maybe potentially more moves to follow up. So let's go with G2.
Me ha sorprendido muchísimo que no entrara en C2, porque me quedaba sin movimientos. Es lo que pretende, le ha dado miedo la diagonal, podría ser que en algún caso funcionara cuando jugara en D7, así que se cura un poco en salud. ¿Qué pasa? Complica un poco las cosas. ¿Por qué? Porque si miramos la paridad, abajo no tenemos paridad, hay 4 en la esquina H8 más 6 en la esquina A8, así que la paridad está repartida en el norte. Si yo juego en C3, cierro toda esta área y él tiene zona de paridad en la derecha. Si lo hago al revés, él va a cambiar. No me gusta jugar en G3 porque él va a mover en H2 inmediatamente y me va a crear un tempo extra que no puedo acceder. Así que G3 está prohibido por culpa de H2. Voy a jugar en C2, que era el movimiento que él tenía que haber jugado. Básicamente solo tengo este movimiento disponible, así que voy a por él. Pasa que voy a cerrar la área de A1, B2, no puedo entrar, así que o consigo que él entre primero o los dos movimientos serán suyos.
So my opponent has in fact captured c2. So this is transforming into somewhat of a very high risk game at the moment, because it's either going to be a huge win for black or a huge win for white.
High risk.
So right now white is just struggling to try to retain access, and black is probably going to try to shut down all my access. So over here I don't really have much options, as you can see. So it's either G3 or H3, and if I can play H3 first, I can still potentially play G3 in the future, and even if he takes G3, I can still play H2 to try to feed that corner and try to capture G1. So most likely, I don't really have much options to the bottom left and also to the top left, and I probably wouldn't consider G1. So yeah, H3 would be probably the only response that I have at the moment.
Solo tenía este movimiento posible, así que mueve en H4 y es bastante arriesgado este final porque un fallo de los dos se transmite en perder la partida. Aquí, ¿qué opciones tenemos? Si analizamos las opciones, tenemos G3, quizás C8. Las otras opciones no parecen lo suficientemente buenas porque algo como G7 corta la diagonal. G3 no me acaba de gustar porque él mueve en H7. Solo tengo opción jugar en G7. Cortaría en H1, H8 con la diagonal cortada y el... ¿Y qué opciones? Si jugamos en C8, C8 es parecido porque él puede mover en B8 y nos quedamos igual. Lo bueno de C8 es que no cortas las fichas C5 y él no puede entrar. Eso sí que sería ventajoso. Vamos a pensar un poco. Necesito un poco pensar a ver qué opción es mejor. Lo importante es desarrollar lo máximo posible para ver el final lo más claro posible. G3 no funciona, principalmente por H2. G3, H2 no tengo opción. Me quedo sin fichas. Vamos a jugar a C4, a C8. Me gusta porque quitas C5 del medio y un problema menos. Y luego, aunque él corte la diagonal moviendo a G3, siempre te queda ese E8 que la volverá a cortar E5. Vamos a probar por aquí.
Okay, so my opponent has played the c8 move. So probably the main purpose of the c8 move would be to actually remove the original c5 disc that I had, which is probably going to provide crucial access for me to actually get moves to attack the both unbalanced edges. Right now I'm just hanging probably by a single move. So the obvious response would be to play b8 to try to retain that access across towards cutting back the main diagonal of playing, cutting across the g3 to c7 diagonal to actually create access along the main diagonal from c3 to f6. So Yep, I think right now I'm just trying to struggle for that access. So, yeah, let's follow with B8.
Ahora estamos jugando movimientos forzados porque casi no tenemos opciones y eso es súper arriesgado porque como haya un movimiento que no funcione no lo puedes ver con mucha antelación, sino que ya viene predeterminado por lo que has seleccionado movimientos antes. Así que no es bastante peligroso estas posiciones. Sin embargo, si hay una victoria, la deberíamos poder de ver, que no lo tengo nada claro. No lo tengo nada claro. Aquí, ¿qué opciones tenemos ahora? No tenemos casi opciones, tenemos opciones G3 y casi que no tenemos otra opción. Lo bueno de G3 es que si él mueve en H2, quita la ficha de 5, el problema es que casi seguro va a jugar en H7. G3, H7 nos deja un poco comprometidos. Vamos a pensar a ver cuál. Si funciona G3, funciona suficientemente bien o no. No lo tengo claro, G3. Lo bueno es que tenemos la diagonal B6, F2 controlada, que hemos de jugar con algo de eso para poder entrar en A8 y que él no pueda entrar. Eso sería ideal. Y movimientos como G3 nos permite aguantar esta posición. Vamos a jugar en G3. Creo que no tengo opciones, pero hemos de seguir por esta línea.
So now my opponent has actually taken away G3. So over here I have essentially just two options. Either I just cut to H2 or I capture H7. So if one potential weakness here is if I were to play H7 and if he were to play something probably more extreme and play maybe H2 and feed the corner, he would actually control that mini diagonal between F2 to B6, which I don't have access to. H7, H2, H1. He could then just play probably an easy follow-up to G8, which I wouldn't be able to feed the unbalanced H, and at the same time I wouldn't have control for the diagonal over here because I don't have access. So he has multiple tempos to the lower right. So for those reasons, probably H2 is looking more attractive for me to try to just cut into the center. So there is a danger that if I play H2, he plays maybe E8 that actually cuts back that move to this to E5, and follow up would be probably quite risky. Okay, so I guess for those reasons, H2 will probably still be my best bet compared to the H7 line. So let's go with H2.
La posición parece que no es mala del todo, pero no me gusta nada en el sentido de que no encontramos la paridad. Sigue él cerrando posiciones. Nosotros apenas tenemos opciones. Podríamos mover en E8, que corta la diagonal y está bien. El problema es que él siempre tiene el movimiento este de B7 que nos impide entrar de cualquier manera. Una opción sería teniendo la fila 7 vacía o intentando algún tipo de swindle viniendo de la diagonal, pero actualmente no lo veo porque necesitaríamos E7 y E5 del mismo color y de color negro. En el momento que cortes E5 o G8, uno de los dos queda del otro color, así que actualmente solo tengo dos opciones, o E8, que parece lo más instintivo, o podríamos jugar algo como G8. G8, ¿qué pasa? G8 también es posible. Vamos a ver cuál funciona mejor. No quiero jugar en E8 porque E8, G8, G7, quiero tener la fila de abajo 8 para intentar entrar en A8 dándole swindle jugando en G1. Es muy arriesgado, pero es que no veo ninguna otra salida. Pero sin embargo, si hago eso no serían suficientes seguro. No funciona, E8 no funciona. Voy a jugar en G8.
So over here my opponent has played to G8, which is not really expected. So now probably requires a count in the end game. So usually when we count lines, we try to count forced lines. So probably two options that I have right now is either H7 or E8. So if I were to go into E8, which is probably going to be a forced line, because if I play E8 and flip F7, my opponent plays black. He can't play G7 because it would be a swindle, and I can take H8 and H7. So if I play E8, the definite response from black would probably be to A8, which I don't have immediate access to A7 to actually try to attack that unbalance H, but I actually have H7, so E8, A8, H7, and then he probably wouldn't jump into G7, which gives me the corner. Instead, he will take H1, and I'll go into G1, which would probably create that access for me into A7 in the future. So the line that I'm counting right now would be E8, A8, H7, black going to H1, I'm going to G1, and black comes down to H8, and I will go into G7, and then black will probably sweep across the seventh row, which is very strong, and then I will probably follow up with the last three moves. So I probably need to count that. So since we're playing online, I don't really have to count the disc on the board. It's already reflected on the top, 18 white disc. So I'll just go with 20 minus 5, 15, plus 4, 19, minus 1, 18, plus 2, 20, minus 6 would be 14, plus 2 would be 16, minus 5 would be 11. And if I were to go down here, it would be plus 6, 17, plus 6, 23, and plus these 5 will be 28, followed by the last move, which is probably going to give me another 6 discs. So I count that line as 34, I guess. If I were to go to H7 instead, the line might be more complicated because he can probably feed E8, and I take the corner and he jumps in. If I go here, I could potentially actually have more discs. But H7 would probably be more complicated line to count, but potentially give me more discs. If I were in a tournament and short of time, I'll probably just go for the easy win to E8. So now counting H7, H7 definitely has more complications in terms of tempo. And if you were to go to H1 first, he would potentially have more tempo to the bottom right, which would probably create more moves for him as well. So let's go with E8 line, I guess. Hopefully I did not miscount that line. Yeah, so I think probably E8 would be the safer bet for me right now. Hopefully I did not miscount this.
Ha jugado en E8, por lo que él ha escogido la línea que probablemente ha contado y le da suficiente. No tengo otra opción ahora que coger A8. No tengo tempos, mover en H1 es un suicidio, igual que G7, así que voy sin movimientos. Lo único bueno es que él no puede entrar en A7, así que jugaríamos A8 y probablemente él tendrá que ir a H7 sacrificando todos los laterales para él coger la esquina 1. Como hemos dicho, la esquina 1, si no entraba él forzado en B2, los dos movimientos serán suyos y hemos de tener cuidado porque no solo las dos paredes las cogerá, también la columna B se nos puede ir. A decir que de momento movemos en A8 y a ver.
Yeah,
no tenemos paridad, intentaremos coger los máximos.
Yeah, so my opponent has played A8, the most logical sequence here, so I'll just follow with probably the only logical move, which is H7.
Lo que decíamos, estamos forzados a coger H1, H8. Por suerte también podemos coger la fila 7, pero él tiene la paridad. Y eso pues, y tiene la paridad más los dos movimientos en B2, más la diagonal que conseguirá, que es la G1 A7, que son unos 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fichas, así que son muchísimas y no podemos hacer nada más. Así que vamos a seguir con la secuencia de H1.
So yeah, my opponent has gone into H1, so we'll just respond with G1. For parity's sake, you probably wouldn't want to go into G7 and actually give him one more flip of the disc to probably F6. So let's go with G1.
Solo tenemos un movimiento posible, H8. Podríamos contar si quisiéramos, pero parece que no será suficiente, sobre todo porque después de H8 él tiene paridad ya hasta el final. Aquí es mirar también cuál, si entra en A7 primero o entra en G7, cuestión de contar. Parece que A7 es mejor.
So my opponent has played H8. Instead of playing the moves to the left, which is more of a spare move for me right now, I probably go with G7 to just continue with the flow, because either way he's going to be sweeping away the 7th row. So let's go with G7.
Jugado en G7, no hemos contado cuál era mejor, pero debe ser parecido. 49.
So black plays the only move he has to B7. So the final sequence will probably be A7, followed by A1, and then B2. There shouldn't be any difference in this unless A7 actually cuts a shorter end to it. So let's go with A7, and followed by A1, and then the last move to B2. Okay, so that's the game for today.
Good game, Alex.
Yeah, good game, Mario. Thank you. Yeah, but thank you for participating in this exhibition game. And yeah, the platform that we are using is actually Othello. So it doesn't really have a time control per se, but if you play on this platform, you can actually make each move on a typical basis of maybe 24, 36, or 72 hours basis. So it's actually quite a good platform for players to actually engage in deep, thought out games. So I definitely recommend this platform.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Mario.